Warning: this episode contains details that some listeners may find disturbing. Built in 1619 in Norfolk, England, Raynham Hall is a master estate that has been home to the Townsend family for over 400 years. Yet it's not its architecture, history, or political ties that captures the public's attention. It's in fact a single photograph taken inside Raynham Hall in 1936, an image said to prove the existence of ghosts. They call her the Brown Lady. Tonight, we're going to explore the truth behind the haunted Raynham Hall and one of the most famous pictures of an alleged ghost that is still discussed and debated today. This is a study of strange. Welcome back to the show. I am your host, Michael May, and since it's the Halloween season, my board of directors, my public at large as well, has forced me to cover a ghost story. So I have chosen to discuss Raynham Hall and the famous photo taken within. If you're listening to this on YouTube, I have an image up over the podcast, and if you're listening in audio only, take a look at my show notes or just Google the Brown Lady Raynham Hall, and you'll see the photo, and I guarantee you've seen it before. If you're a fan of ghost stories, you will want to listen to this one. September 19th, 1936. Country Life magazine has dispatched 2 photographers to Raynham Hall to capture images of the estate. Country Life is still around to this day, actually, and they feature country and stately homes and quaint neighborhoods. They do not tell stories of paranormal or mysteries or anything like that. Now, the common story, the one you always read when you learn about this photograph, is that a Captain Hubert Provend was the photographer, and he was with his assistant, Eindrid Shira, a Scottish gentleman. Not to nerd out super early in the episode, but that's not true at all. Eindrid Shira was the photographer, ran his own studio in London, and his art director was Captain Hubert Provend. While the exact camera they brought isn't exactly known, there is debate about it, it was an older camera. It was fitted with a symmetrical RR-type doublet lens and used Kodak SS ortho film. Imagine one of those really old cameras with those accordion-type lenses and the black drape that goes over the back that the photographer ducks his head under to take a photo. They were about to photograph the grand staircase in Raynham Hall, an intricate oak showpiece added by the Palladian architect William Kent in the early 1700s. The two had taken a picture, and it was underexposed, so they were about to take a second one. To discuss what happened next, I'm going to quote from the Country Life article in 1936. A genuine case of spirit photography has yet to be proved. Those so far investigated either proving to be fakes or impossible to authenticate owing to the absence of witnesses. Yet the following account and illustration of what happened at Raynham Hall deserves attention, since this particular photograph was taken in the ordinary course of measure and not under any special circumstance. The case has been investigated by Mr. Harry Price, Secretary of the University of London Council for Psychical Investigation, who can give no explanation of the occurrences. And now, in the same article, this is Eindrid Shira talking about what happened. On September 19th, 1936, Captain Provend, the art director of Eindrid Shira Limited, court photographers of 49 Dover Street, Piccadilly, London, and I were taking photographs of Raynham Hall. We commenced shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning and had taken a large number of pictures of the house and grounds when, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we came to the oak staircase. Captain Provend took one photograph of it while I flashed the light. He was focusing again for another exposure. I was standing by his side just behind the camera with the flashlight pistol in my hand, looking directly up the staircase. All at once, I detected an ethereal, veiled form coming slowly down the stairs. Rather excitedly, I called out sharply, "Quick, quick, there's something, are you ready?" "Yes," the photographer replied, and removed the cap from the lens. I pressed the trigger of the flashlight pistol. After the flash and on closing the shutter, Captain Provend turned to me and said, "What's all the excitement about?" I directed his attention to the staircase and explained that I had distinctly seen a figure there, transparent so that the steps were visible through the ethereal form, but nevertheless very definite and to me perfectly real. He laughed and said I must have imagined I had seen a ghost, for there was nothing now to be seen. So that is the story directly from Indrid Shira. And for context, the exposure time for this picture was roughly 6 seconds. When they developed the negative in their London studio at 49 Dover Street, the eerie silhouette of a figure in a flowing gown emerged. Her face was blurred, her hands clasped as if in prayer. The photograph was published in Country Life on December 26, 1936, and then on January 4th of 1937, it was republished in Life in the United States. It would become one of the most famous paranormal images ever taken. The ghost would become known as the Brown Lady, and I'll explain that momentarily, but it's interesting to note that the homeowner, the Dowager Marchioness of Raynham Hall, thought that it looked like the Virgin Mary, and it does indeed kind of look like most statues of the Virgin Mary. You can kind of see a veil, the hands in prayer, the stoic face. And speaking of the owner of the home, the Dowager Marchioness, her name was Gladys Townsend. She had been restoring Raynham Hall since her husband's death in 1921. She believed the hall was haunted, and she had even recently published a collection of tales entitled True Ghost Stories. The estate had fallen on hard times. Like many great houses at the turn of that century, there had been political changes, economic changes. There was also an agricultural depression, and it had drained the coffers of the estate. And Gladys Townsend wanted to save Raynham Hall. So, before I go any further, let's talk about the Brown Lady. Who is the Brown Lady? Why did they call the ghost that? For that, we need to go back to the beginning of this stately home. It was commissioned by Sir Roger Townsend in 1619 and later expanded by Charles Turnip Townsend. He was called Turnip because of his interest in farming turnips. And he was a powerful statesman outside of that as well. He married twice, and it's his second wife, Dorothy Walpole, who many believe is the Brown Lady. Lady Dorothy Dolly, as she was called by her friends, was born in 1686. She was the 13th child of Colonel Robert Walpole and Mary Burrell. Her brother was Sir Robert Walpole, who was Britain's first prime minister, and she was also aunt to the author Horace Walpole. She fell in love with her father's ward, Charles Townsend, and they married in 1713 and had 7 children. The common story of what you hear next is that Dorothy was unhappy in her marriage, and she was caught having an affair with a gentleman named Thomas Wharton, the first Marquis of Wharton. Charles was so enraged at discovering Dorothy was having an affair that he locked her in her rooms in Raynham Hall, forbid her to ever leave again, forbid her from seeing her children even, and she lived the rest of her life locked in Raynham Hall. Yet there is no evidence that this actually happened. And this is primarily rumor and folklore. There are also various versions of this story. That's the common one. In other versions, Dorothy was the mistress to Thomas Wharton before she married. Some versions say that Thomas Wharton's wife is the one that discovered the affair. And some versions claim that Dorothy was murdered in the home because of this. In fact, we know she was not murdered because she died of smallpox in 1726. Unless that was a cover-up of some kind. Regardless of that debate with the historical accuracy of Dorothy's life, tales of ghosts and haunts began soon after she died. The idea that Raynham Hall was haunted was already an old story by 1936, when this photograph became famous. Folklore, even from the 1700s, insists that Dorothy was restless in the afterlife. At first, she was known as the family ghost, and she would appear to people in a brown silk dress. And by the 19th century, this story of the ghost of Dorothy was already local lore and was being talked about by the family. The first recorded incident was in 1835 during a Christmas party. A Major Luftus and a friend encountered a woman in a brown silk dress on a landing. Luftus called out to her, at which point she just immediately disappeared. Luftus didn't quite know what to think, but being rather curious and courageous as well, he placed himself nearby where he figured he might see this woman again. And sure enough, he did. A woman in a brown dress appeared, and she was moving near him. And this time, she turned towards him. And he said he suddenly saw that her eyes were just empty sockets. He shouted out and called to the woman, and then she just immediately disappeared again. Local legend says that in the morning, Luftus made a sketch of this ghostly figure, and that it so terrified the servants of the house that many of them quit their job and moved out immediately. The following year, the novelist Captain Frederick Marryat accepted an invitation to stay at Raynham Hall, and his goal was to debunk the ghost. According to his daughter Florence, he slept with a loaded revolver beneath his pillow, suspecting that smugglers were using the story as a haunted house as cover so they could sneak in and presumably steal some things. On the third night that he was there, 2 young nephews of the baronet came to fetch him. They wanted to show him their new gun. They were very excited about it. Marryat was preparing for bed, and he wasn't fully dressed. He was wearing some pants and like a button-up shirt, but being 1836, that's not appropriate to go out in public like that. But he figured, hey, it's just 2 dudes asking me to come down the hallway, check out their gun. So he didn't put on his full getup, and he started walking down the hallway with these 2 men. However, before he left, he grabbed his gun and jokingly told the 2 guys, just in case we bump into the brown lady. As they're going down this dark hallway, they see a glimmer of a lamp at the other end. Out of modesty, since he was just in his shirt sleeves, Marryat ducked behind a door. He watched as a woman approached. Her clothing and appearance matched the portrait of Dorothy which was hanging in his bedroom. It was the brown lady herself. As she passed by, she slowed down and she lifted the lamp up to her face, and Marryat said that she grinned in a diabolical manner. He was staring right into the face of a ghost. Frightened, Marryat lifted his gun and fired. The bullet passed right through the figure and lodged itself into a door across the hall. The ghost vanished immediately, and the captain refused to stay another night. Raynham Hall's hauntings were now legendary, and over the years, children whispered and discussed this brown-dressed lady entering their bedrooms. Other spirits soon joined the tale. The ghost of James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, an illegitimate son of Charles II, who had once stayed at Raynham Hall, a pair of phantom children, and even a ghost dog that would wander around. I love ghost dogs. Yet the brown lady remained the star of the show, and her story was told and retold as the century turned. But by the late 1800s, prosperity had waned, and an agricultural slump left many great estates struggling. Raynham Hall's 6th Marquis inherited a bankrupt property in 1899. He had to sell artwork and furniture and antiques and heirlooms, all just to pay for the property. You can actually look up and see some of the information about what was sold in the early 1900s during this time. And the other thing he did is he was seeking a wealthy bride. And if anybody's watching The Gilded Age on HBO, a similar situation just happened to one of the main characters in that show. So this is a very real situation for these great estates at the time. And the Marquis was fortunate because in 1905, he married Gladys Southerst, who it is assumed came with a nice dowry. And she was known as a vivacious woman who would later champion the hall's restoration. When the Marquis died in 1921, his estate's future was uncertain. Across Britain, Many stately homes were crumbling, but something existed for their owners to attract visitors, potentially make money, and also not let the public forget about these amazing homes. And that thing was ghosts. These kind of situations always make me think of the movie High Spirits. It was one of my favorite movies growing up, and it's about this castle, I think in Ireland. It stars Peter O'Toole and Steve Guttenberg and Liam Neeson and a bunch of other people. And in order to make money for this old castle so they don't have to sell it, they start telling everybody that the castle is haunted. The twist in the movie, though, is that it turns out to actually really be haunted, even though they were faking it for a while. Anyway, check out High Spirits. I don't know if it's age. I haven't seen it since I was a kid, but I definitely loved it when I was a child. And you do find this strategy still. You still see restaurants, old homes, old hotels really lean into haunted stories because it does draw attention. It draws business. Honestly, it's just kind of a smart thing to do because most of us, myself included, love ghost stories. And Gladys understood this. However, as much as she had her eye on making money and drawing attention for the estate, she was apparently a spiritualist. Spiritualism was still a prominent movement happening in the world. It had waned since the 1800s, but it was still going on in the 1920s, and it was very popular amongst the upper crest of society at the time in England. And for those that aren't aware, I have talked about spiritualism a little bit, including the William Mumler episode, one of my first episodes about spirit photography, so there's some connection to this episode. And spiritualism is the movement and belief that we can communicate with the dead. In 1936, the Dowager Marchioness, Gladys Townsend, published True Ghost Stories, and she created this book with the help of writer Maud Fawkes, who wrote silent films, plays, novels, and now a book chronicling ghost stories. Gladys's son George even claimed to see a transparent woman on the staircase in 1926 that he believed was the Brown Lady. And that brings us to the photograph in question of the Brown Lady on the staircase. When this picture was published in Country Magazine and then Life and starts spreading around, it draws a lot of attention. It also drew the attention of the Society for Psychical Research, a group that is still around, and it studies, with an appropriate air of skepticism, supernatural and paranormal events. One of their investigators, Harry Price, examined the negative. He could not find evidence that it was fake. However, he did say if it was fake, it had to be the two photographers. They had to have, some kind of skills or plan to pull this off. Country Life presented this picture without naming the ghost. I mentioned this earlier, but Lady Townsend actually thought that it was a spirit of the Virgin Mary. However, the Brown Lady, because of the folklore, the history of the property, that caught on, and that is now what everybody refers to as the ghost of Raynham Hall. If you're a regular listener to A Study of Strange, you know I'm skeptical about these things, so I have to go down the avenue of exploring some information, evidence, and facts that may point to this not being a real ghost. And I'll first mention William Mumler, the spirit photographer that I have covered in one of my first episodes of A Study of Strange. He took many photographs of supposed ghosts. And today, with our modern eye, we can kind of see where it's likely double exposure and it's fake. But at the time, people weren't used to that, and a lot of people believed it. But he was caught being a fraud multiple times. I mention that because you could look at the Brown Lady with an air of skepticism and say, oh, this is double exposure. You had even seen this technique in movies. There's a 1921 movie that comes to mind, I think it's 1921, maybe a little later, called The Phantom Carriage, where there's a ghost carriage and ghost throughout the whole movie, and they use this very simple technique of double exposure, and it has a similar look to the Brown Lady photograph. However, the reason I think this photograph is still debated today is that it looks better than those early spirit photographs. It's a little more vague. It's not as detailed and specific, and that allows your mind to wander, your imagination to fill in blanks. And some people think it really does look like a ghost. So the question is this real? And how do we go about figuring that out? For me, it comes down to two things: the photograph itself and the Dowager Marchioness, Lady Townsend, and what her circumstances were at the time of this photograph. So first, the photograph. The Society for Psychical Research kept investigating this photograph, including Nandor Fodor, who's famous for investigating Jeff the Talking Mongoose. So they discovered that Pravind and Shira, the photographers, were using a second-hand camera. The bellows were worn, and Pravind himself worried that light might leak through them, which could create double exposure unintentionally. They took two photos of the staircase. The first, without the ghost, was underexposed, and the second was exposed for about 6 seconds, and that revealed this ghostly figure. Such a long exposure meant any movement or stray light could affect the image. Nandor Fodor from the Society noted a vertical shake that produced duplicate lines on the stairs, suggesting the camera had either been bumped or jarred, or there was purposeful double exposure. They also measured the apparition and estimated her to be about 4 feet tall, which is consistent for the size of a lot of statues of the Virgin Mary, and shorter than what we assume Dorothy Walpole was, who is assumed to be the Brown Lady ghost. Not that ghosts have to be the same size as their human counterparts, but, it's worth discussing. Researchers later reproduced the image by superimposing a statuette of the Virgin Mary onto a blank staircase. Now, it's not an exact reproduction, but it is very similar. Joe Nickel and Kenny Biddle, writing for the Skeptical Inquirer, have concluded that the photograph is most likely a deliberate double exposure. More intrigue emerges when we learn that Indrid Shira was apparently a pseudonym. He was a Scottish man with a psychic wife, and Hubert Provind may also have been an alias. The duo operated a photography studio at 49 Dover Street in London, and apparently they were struggling financially. A sensational ghost photograph, published the same year as Lady Townsend's ghost book, could hardly have been better publicity for their studio. Additionally, to achieve the same look as this ghost in the photograph, you can also put grease or a smudge on the lens to achieve the same effect. And again, it is vague enough. It does look like Madonna or the Virgin Mary, but it's vague enough that it could just be a smudge. So those are things to consider with the photograph. The second thing we have to consider here is the Dowager Marchioness, Gladys Townsend. I already mentioned that earlier, but it's really important to understand this context. She inherited this estate, and it is very costly to keep and manage. Though she came from money, it's not easy. Other estates were leaning into ghostly phenomena at the time to generate business and press, like Chillingham Castle in Northumberland, which is not far away. It published a guidebook in 1925, and there are many ghostly tales and stories of haunts associated with Chillingham Castle. Country life also drew parallels between these two places. On top of that, you have these other great estates like Blickling Hall, which advertised that Anne Boleyn's headless ghost was wandering around the property. Also, Buckland Abbey had stories of Sir Francis Drake's ghost, and Ham House was sharing stories about ghostly servants. So, Gladys Townsend publishes her own book about ghosts, and a prominent focus is her own house. And just as that book is coming out, there's a new photograph of a ghost on the great stairs of that same estate. If you can't figure it out from my tone, the implication here is that the Brown Lady ghost, which is still hotly debated between believers and skeptics alike today, could have been taken to help promote Raynham Hall and Gladys Townsend's book, which had just come out. And if that's the case, if that was the goal with this photograph, it succeeded beyond any expectation Gladys Townsend could have ever had, because we're still talking about it almost 100 years later. Raynham Hall remains a living home. The Townsend family still occupies its rooms, and its ghosts continue to be part of its charm. Whether the photograph shows a spirit or it's a superimposed statue, the image has kept Raynham Hall in the public imagination and for those that do believe in ghosts. If the photograph is fake, that doesn't mean Raynham Hall is not haunted. It just means that photograph is fake. So, what, if anything, have we learned? I would say that history is a wonder, and that folklore and truth work hand in hand. Folklore helps us maintain stories that would otherwise be lost to time, and it helps us stay curious about the past. You've just listened to A Study of Strange. Consider helping us keep the lantern lit, illuminating the unexplained, by subscribing to our Substack. Just head to the support tab at astudyofstrange.com. Until next time, stay curious and stay strange.